Hello, my name is Victoria, and today I will be conducting a visual analysis on the movie The Substance, which was debuted in 2024 and directed by Coralie Farge. This movie won the Best Screenplay at the Festival des Cannes, and it is a body horror thriller film that breaks down the male gaze and critiques society's obsession with vanity. Interestingly enough, Universal actually lost the rights to this movie because they did not agree on how visceral and grotesque the ending was, which is actually why Mubi claimed it first, and it wasn't released onto other major streaming services until very recently. Just thought that was interesting. Before we dive into this film, I think it's important to highlight these two theories. And the first one I want to start with is Leslie Rabine's A Woman's Two Bodies, Fashion Magazine, Consumerism, and Feminism. In this essay, Rabine highlights the idea that the woman body can be split into two separate categories, one being the desiring, imperfect, natural feminine body, and the other being this glamorized, commodified, fashionable, kind of Hollywood, sexually liberating, powerful body that becomes a feminine mystique. Um, Elizabeth's character, as she in this movie is coming up on her 50th birthday, also represents what Rabine coins as the modern self-reflecting object, where the more she is portrayed as independent, the more she is portrayed as an object of the male look. This is basically to say that in this movie, Elizabeth is brutally self-aware of the fact that she is nearing the end of her career, that she's being phased out, her network doesn't really want her anymore, and at this point, her character is becoming irrelevant in the eyes of Hollywood. Laura Mulvey's theory within visual pleasure narrative basically says that Hollywood orients the audience and us watching the movie from the position of the camera, which is set in the male gaze. Mulvey talks about the use of scopophilia, exhibitionism, and voyeurism to describe how we watch these characters on screen and we watch these transformations and these grotesque moments where Elizabeth would normally be alone, and we get to see these really intimate moments within the characters. Moreover, Mulvey also talks about the idea of women being the erotic spectacle within film through the eyes of an active male figure and a passive female figure. We see film use these voyeuristic and fetishistic mechanisms in order to alleviate the anxiety of castration. And this is rooted in the idea that a man has a penis and a woman lacks a penis, and therefore is a threat, because the idea of losing manhood is supposed to be this major fear as it symbolizes the loss of manhood. And women who innately do not have that manhood thus become a threatening figure that in film is either A, investigated, or B, controlled or subdued in some way. And we see this very well happen in this movie where Elizabeth and her body is controlled. Her job relies on the idea of if her network finds her attractive enough, and it leads her into a spiral of obsession with maintaining relevance through the use of the substance. I want to talk about the opening scene of this film because I think it is a really interesting way that we see the usage of the Hollywood star being a stand-in for the progression of Elizabeth Sparkle's career. We see that the Hollywood star gets put in, she walks the red carpet, but then over time, the star starts to crack. Time starts to pass on, she begins to lose her relevance and her fame, and people just don't really recognize her as much anymore. We even see somebody at the very end of the sequence drop their lunch on it and just kind of start smearing the food with their foot, almost to say that her career is just kind of being smeared into the ground and is garbage. I want to talk about Elizabeth's character alone before mentioning Sue, because we actually see this idea of the fashionable feminine body and the desiring imperfect body within Elizabeth's character alone. And this is supposed to be basically showing that Elizabeth ultimately just wants to have a sense of identity. Elizabeth maintained her career through her beauty with the Sparkle Your Life, which is an 80s style aerobic fitness show, where her only skill throughout her career was basically maintaining her looks. And her network knew this when they casted her out at 50 years old. They knew that she really didn't have any other skills outside of Hollywood besides just being attractive. She didn't seem to have any acting skills or singing or music skills. This show seemed to be kind of her one and only thing. We see that Elizabeth Sparkle as a character is very confident, very outgoing. She kisses the camera. She loves the attention. She loves the spotlight. Elizabeth gave up her life for this show. She gave up family. She gave up the idea of marriage or children. We see her live alone in this movie, and her only company is really this giant picture behind her of herself. From the outside looking in, Elizabeth is the idea of a modern woman who has her own house, her own show. She has her own Hollywood star. She's just kind of the embodiment of every girl's dream. However, we see Lizzie, who is Elizabeth Sparkle's true self. We see that she is actually deeply insecure. And it's not until this character named Fred comes on the scene that she goes by Elizabeth Sparkle, and he's really the only one that calls her out by Lizzie. He says, Lizzie from 10th grade homeroom, showing that he's really the only one that recognizes who this person is outside of this fake Hollywood persona that she portrays. The next character I want to talk about in this movie is Harvey, who acts as the CEO or like the network producer of Sparkle Your Life, the show that Elizabeth works on. The first time we meet Harvey is a sequence in the male bathroom where Elizabeth is forced to use the male bathroom because the women's bathroom is out of order. And according to Caroline Farge, the director of this movie, this was an intentional choice to show that Elizabeth is subject to Harvey's control. She's subject to kind of this idea of like the man's world is a man's world. And ultimately she's subject to the male gaze, and her work is over when the men say that it's over or that society says that she is not attractive anymore. Also, I think it's interesting that in both of these scenes that we get with Harvey, he is a very loud and dominating figure, the way that Mulvey points out. Mulvey's theory within visual pleasure and narrative cinema also discusses how women and men are framed within film in order to achieve this idea of the male gaze. Mulvey comments how the male character often takes up a lot of space, he dominates the screen, and we see this occur in The Substance as the director actually chose to use a fishbowl camera lens for this bathroom shot. This is a similar film technique that we see in Silence of the Lambs with Hannibal Lecter's character versus Clarice's character, where Hannibal Lecter dominates the entire screen and is supposed to show his threatening presence and his control over the situation. We see direct and stark contrast between Clarice Starling's character in Silence of the Lambs and Elizabeth's character in this sequence, where Elizabeth is positioned far away from the camera and she's just kind of standing there looking at herself, passive and in no place to control the situation whatsoever. She is completely at the will of her boss, and from his perspective, if he finds her attractive enough to keep working. This is re-emphasized in the dinner sequence where Elizabeth's character is sitting directly across from Harvey that is just grotesquely eating, and it's a very auditory scene where there's a lot of close-ups of the shrimp being thrown into Harvey's mouth and he's sloppily eating. and it's just squealing and squishing in his mouth, and he's spitting it right back out, while Elizabeth is eating nothing. And this stark comparison is to show greed. Harvey is very greedy, and the same way that he eats and spits out the shrimp is the same way that he eats women and young women and spits them right back out as part of this machine and this constant, I need something new, I need hot, I need young, I need fresh mentality. In the dinner sequence, he says that at 50, it stops. Elizabeth says, what stops? He says, well, you know. The reason that this detail is included is because at this point, as Elizabeth nears 50, Harvey is feeling the most of this castration anxiety because Elizabeth is no longer able to fit the mold of the fetish. Since she cannot be fetish sized, she must be punished. She must be abject. She must be cast out. And this is exactly what we see happen when she's fired from her show. I also think it's an important visual detail to note that in the background sequence of the dinner scene, there is a female waitress wearing a very short skirt, and we see her rear view very much exposed as Harvey's talking. And in this scene, he's talking about needing young, needing fresh. This is again to show that Harvey's main MO and his main drive and his motivation throughout this movie is just to find hot young women to profit off of so that he can keep his network's rating up. And ultimately, the people watching that network are likely other men that are just trying to fetishize women. We see this kind of it's a man's world continue on even with other male characters. For example, after the dinner sequence, Elizabeth is driving home where she's suddenly distracted by her billboard being torn down by two male characters. Moreover, Harvey's character, the CEO, gifts Elizabeth a French cookbook as a farewell gift from the company to thank her for all those years of hard work. In this sense, it's very much a slap in the face because her network is well aware of the sacrifice and the years that she's given up to maintain the success. And now, Elizabeth, who really has no other skills outside of this show, is given a cookbook and basically told, now you have time to get back to what you're supposed to be doing in the kitchen. I think it's important to note that on the cover of the French cookbook is another male figure. Finally, I think it's equally important to address that the actual way that Elizabeth finds out about the substance is through this perfect male figure who is actively under the substance himself. I think this is a scene where a male figure is talking down at Elizabeth once again, the same way that Harvey did, and the same way that she's been beaten up this entire day just by male figures on her 50th birthday, basically to say that according to the men and the male gaze, as soon as she turned 50, her time was up. She was no longer attractive. Her time's over with the company, and her life feels ruined now because that was all that Elizabeth had. We can see then, with the emergence of the substance in the film for the first time, that this is truly a stand-in for any beauty product ever in our society that promises fast, quick results, instant weight loss, look younger, get fit fast, get rich quick. It's this idea that a singular commodity or a singular purchase could change your life. And it's this fake promise of self-improvement. And yet, our society craves this. In fact, in 2025 alone, it is projected that the beauty industry will gross to $677 billion annually. And within the film, the rules of the substance are a little tricky to follow, but basically, Elizabeth must initially activate herself in order to release a second version. This second version then must use a stabilizer fluid, which is derived from the cerebrospinal fluid of the original person. So in this case, Sue must use the stabilizer and derives that stabilizer fluid from Elizabeth's spine. This is also to represent how, as we crave for beauty and youth while we are young, we actively harm our health in our older age. It is no secret that anorexia and eating disorders are very common among young women, and they are also the deadliest mental health disorder to date. This again just shows how in our youth we tend to feed upon our older selves, and we see this occur in the substance, obviously. The most important rule that the movie tells both characters throughout the film is that they are one. Elizabeth is the matrix, and the matrix represents this desiring imperfect body. The matrix is something that can be built upon to create the fashionable feminine body. Additionally, I think it is important to note that there is an illusion of secrecy with the substance. The substance is basically a black market drug where there is no manufacturer. Elizabeth must go to a back alley just to go get it. There's never any communication other than some eerie audio recordings or videos. And I think this speaks more so on a societal level as to how we all recognize what it takes to maintain beauty, but we all try to keep it secret at the same time. Within the realm of Hollywood, many celebrities are extremely hush-hush about the body modifications they've had done, the surgeries they've had done, any weight loss drugs that they're on, or any fitness or dietary regimens that they're on to maintain that look. If they did that, it would break the illusion of Hollywood and break this idea that that is unattainable. It would break this need for commodity and for consumerism. So as a result, it must remain a secret the same way that this substance remains a secret. I also want to highlight that it's a really interesting visual that throughout this film, Elizabeth maintains the yellow coat, whereas Sue's character doesn't. In the opening sequence, we see the substance being demonstrated on an egg yolk, where once injected, the egg yolk generates into two egg yolks. This again is just a visual to show that Elizabeth alone is the matrix and that Sue is just a derivative out of Elizabeth. This leads us to Sue's character, who obviously represents the commodified body, the fashionable feminine body, the free sexual spirit that perfectly fits the male gaze. And once again, this show Pump It Up that she stars in perfectly embodies the male gaze and the trends throughout the decades. Elizabeth's show was very 70s and 80s retro, aerobics, jazzercise inspired, and now Sue's show is extremely hypersexualized with close-ups of her boobs and her butt and hip motions and contractions. And honestly, it looks more like a porno than anything. Um, and I think this is just supposed to represent that Sue is this extremely hyper feminized, perfect. Sue is supposed to represent exactly what the male gaze wants. She is completely aware of her sexiness, of her liberation, but also she still maintains this look of innocence and sweetness, and she still tries to act submissive to Harvey to appeal to him and to the network. However, once again, as the substance rule stated, Sue and Elizabeth are one. And everything that Sue does affects Elizabeth because Elizabeth is the Matrix. And we start to see throughout the course of the movie just how badly this affects Elizabeth, both physically and mentally. Aside from just physically deteriorating from the use of cerebrospinal fluid being pulled from her back, Elizabeth becomes completely agoraphobic in this movie. She does not leave her house on the weeks where she has to be Elizabeth. Every time she switches back into Elizabeth, she becomes even more depressed and even more spiteful and hateful of herself. And she even grows increasingly resentful of Sue's character for taking up all the spotlight and taking away from her and being greedy and overusing and overstaying her time as Sue. She constantly calls the people manufacturing the substance only to blame Sue, and they will constantly tell her that she is the Matrix and that they are one person. This is to say that Elizabeth cannot let go of her youth, of her vanity. She cannot let go of Sue. Whenever it is her time to be Sue, she feels the need to stay Sue because she cannot stand to be herself. She cannot stand the fact that she is old and that her company has thrown her out and that she is to her limit. So instead, she continues to take and take from herself to the point where she even takes 3 months of stabilizer or cerebrospinal fluid out of herself, only to end up completely deteriorated. We see this cost of beauty happen near the end of the sequence when Elizabeth, the old woman on the right, actually tries to terminate Sue's character entirely, but she physically and mentally cannot. In the scene where she tries to terminate Sue and tries to put an end to the experience because of how badly it is messing with her own health, she starts crying and she says, I can't. I hate myself. I need you. I need you. And this is to show this inescapable yet self-reflecting object. Elizabeth can never escape the system. She can never escape her need for perfectionism and for relevance and for vanity. So instead, she takes the role of the self-reflecting object where she acknowledges her role, but she doesn't do anything to stop it. I also think, interestingly enough, we see a self-hatred of both the fashionable feminine body and the desiring body in this movie. Elizabeth grows increasingly resentful of Sue's sexually powerful, free, feminine body because she cannot have it and she cannot maintain that forever on her own. She thinks that Sue is selfish, that she's stealing from her. She thinks that Sue is cocky and isn't necessarily remembering where she came from in Elizabeth, while Sue's character is disgusted by Elizabeth and says that she's old, and she starts murderously beating on Elizabeth to the point that she actually ends up killing Elizabeth. This is where we see the emergence of Monstro Eliza Sue, which occurs because Sue has completely killed the Matrix. Without the Matrix, without Elizabeth, there is no Sue. So Sue begins to rapidly deteriorate. And this is again where now even Sue's character becomes a split between the fashionable feminine body and the desiring imperfect body. Due to Elizabeth being dead, Sue's character begins to decay and deteriorate, and we see this occur when she loses teeth and they fall out right before the New Year's show. As soon as she sees this mark of imperfection on herself, she immediately transitions from being the fashionable feminine body back to the desiring imperfect body. She says, I just need a better version of myself. Please give me a better version of myself. Please. As she takes the activator again to create yet another mutant, another version. And because the activator was only supposed to be single use and only supposed to create one alternate version, the second alternate version becomes an absolute genetic monstrosity. And this scene is supposed to represent this cling and this need for vanity. The fact that now, at this point, even Sue's character is not good enough. Sue's character doesn't even fit the male gaze. Sue now needs an even better version of perfect. And weirdly enough, and according to the director, the scene where this monstrous form of Elizabeth sees herself for the first time is the only time in the movie when a character is truly looking at themselves in the mirror and when Elizabeth looks at herself in the mirror and actually reaches a point of acceptance. Throughout the entire movie, we see Elizabeth staring at herself with disgust. We see Sue staring at herself with just self-absorbment and just exhilaration for the fact that she finally has her youth again. But with the monster Eliza Sue, it's just a period where Elizabeth, for once, sees everything all at once. And she truly just recognizes and begins to appreciate her body for what it is. There's a scene in this movie where she even tries to put on earrings and she tries to curl what little hair she has left. And then she goes back to the New Year's Eve party and the show that she's supposed to host as if nothing ever happened, as if she's not this grotesque, monstrous form, but she's just Elizabeth. That's all Elizabeth ever wanted to be was just herself. She never wanted to be Sue, nor did she ever want Sue to take another version of herself. She just wanted Elizabeth. We see this occur as instead of taping a picture of Sue's face, there's a picture of Elizabeth Sparkle's face taped onto the monster. And the monster is clapped for and applauded for. And it is a moment where Elizabeth finally just feels recognized and she feels relevant again. She feels loved. She doesn't feel empty anymore. The show that she worked so hard for all her life was the only thing and the only source of validation that she ever had because she never really took the time to form any close relationships with anybody outside of work. We also see at the very end of the movie, and this was interesting to watch behind the scenes because they actually used 30,000 gallons of fake blood to film the sequence with the blood being spread all over the audience. I would say that this scene where the monster just kind of deteriorates and starts spraying blood everywhere is supposed to represent the blood on Hollywood's hands and this idea of a trickle-down effect that we see in society in terms of warping women's perspectives on themselves and this fight for beauty and this beauty is pain mentality. And ultimately, beauty can become self-destructive and kill us. That if we fight too hard to try to maintain it and we allow it to become too internalized. I think this bloodshed on the audience is supposed to be a visceral reality check that this glamour that Hollywood presents is all an illusion. Everybody is an imperfect natural body, and this is all a world of commodity and fakeness. And the audience being doused in blood during a New Year's Eve party celebration just goes to show a moment that was supposed to be so perfect and so meticulously planned and coordinated through the network is completely ruined and sabotaged just through the idea of the mask falling off. The final sequence of this scene, I actually coined the never-ending sequence because it ultimately highlights how even once Elizabeth goes, the substance does not. The substance remains forever. Even after Elizabeth finally makes it back to her star and she dies there, laying happy, imagining herself surrounded by fans and just feeling accepted for once, she dies and is immediately cleaned up and mopped over by this machine, basically going to show that her time has come and gone and she is just another cog in the machine. Once again, Elizabeth's character is a self-reflecting object. She understands her role and she acknowledges it, and she acknowledges how her insecurities are placed onto her by this system, but she herself cannot break this system and ultimately succumbs to it. Overall, this film is kind of a telltale warning sign about staying away from the obsession and the idea of commodity and glamour and this idea of perfection within ourselves and within our self-image. It's an important statistic to highlight that in 2025, it is projected that in the US alone, we spend $104 billion within the beauty industry. The US is the leading consumers within the beauty industry, and it is averaged that women will spend $3,700 annually alone on beauty. I think that this movie speaks to a much larger societal issue and truly reflects upon this idea.